Unit 19, Performance of the Indian Economy. This unit follows from and builds up on the previous two. In the first unit in this block, you learnt about the structure and framework of the Indian economy. In the second, you became familiar with the fascinating story of economic planning in India. The present unit examines the performance of the Indian economy and later also discusses the reforms which were introduced in the Indian economy explicitly in 1991. It looks at the development strategy and the instruments to realize plan objectives and then assesses the performance of the economy. The performance of the Indian economy was not up to expectation and set the scene for us to introduce economic reforms. India emerged from colonial rule as a free nation in 1947. It soon set about the task of developing its economy and raising the standards of living of its people in right earnest. The major project that India embarked upon has been called nation building, economic development and transformation is an integral part of that project. When India became free, it inherited a set of institutions and policy framework from earlier times. Also, the economy was at a low level of development. Given this level of development, given the institutional framework of the economy, and with the instruments and resources at its disposal, the policymakers devised a set of strategies to push forward the growth and development of the economy. What the strategies were and which instruments were used is what we discuss below. 19.2 The formulation of a development strategy. In the previous unit, you studied the process of planning in India. You have learned that for each plan, there were certain stated objectives, certain desired rate of growth of the national income, and the required investment for realizing this growth. The basic strategy of development adopted in India was the following. Ever since independence, a rapid rise in national income and in the standard of living has been the stated goal of development. Even for removal of poverty, it was felt that the economy has to display high rates of growth. Redistribution of existing wealth was not though entirely feasible. It was also thought that there would not be much to redistribute. So faith was placed on the growth process. However, growth, though necessary, was by no means sufficient to transform the economy and also to uphold the ideals of the constitution. Thus, social justice became an added and enduring objective. Along with this, because India had just emerged from colonial rule, there was a mistrust of the international economy, and faith was placed on self reliance. By the second 5 year plan, self reliance took the form of import substitution. Later, in the fourth 5 year plan, self reliance came to be seen as less and less reliance on foreign investment. Thus, growth with social justice and self reliance defined in the aforementioned scene remained the central and enduring objectives of development for a long time. We discussed in detail about planning in Unit 18 of this course. Even before independence, national leaders were convinced about the efficacy of planning for a poor country such as India. The National Planning Committee, appointed by the Indian National Congress and headed by Jawaharlal Nehru, submitted its report in 1938. The committee felt that India had to industrialize. The three essential for this were thought to be: number one, heavy engineering and machine making industry; second, scientific research institutes; and third, electric power. The committee was of the view that even with international interdependence among nations and even allowing for cottage and small scale industries to be economically strong, India must be industrialized in terms of big scale industries and develop its power sector. National leaders, especially left wing ones like Nehru and Subhas Bose, were not the only proponents of planning. As early as 1934, noted industrialists Sir M. Vishweswaraya wrote his book Planned Economy for India. He argued that for India to prosper, industrialization is a must. And to industrialize rapidly, the process must be organized and planned. Similarly, the so-called Bombay Plan 1944 by a group of industrialists also emphasized industrialization. After independence, first the Congress Party in 1953 and then the Parliament in 1954 accepted socialistic pattern of society as the objective of economic and social policy. Thinkers on development emphasized industrialization as the basic growth strategy because they had learnt of the experience of Europe and USA, which had gone through industrial revolution. This had transformed their economies and raised their national incomes and the standard of living of their people several fold. It marked the beginning of new epoch of modern economic growth, as economist Simon Kuznets put it. The Industrial Revolution was made possible by the application of science and technology and inventions like steam engine, power loom, modern harvester thresher, and so on. Later on, Soviet Union also industrialized as a socialist nation with the commanding heights of economy, the heavy industry power and infrastructure under state control. Moreover, the USSR had also become a military power. The USSR had transformed its economy in a matter of decades. All this had impressed the Indian leaders. Soon after independence, the first resolution on industrial policy in April 1948 stressed the importance of planning for the economy and expressed the desire that a national planning commission be set up for the formulation and execution of development programs. The planning commission was set up in 1950. The first 5-year plan was a basic collection of projects, did not have much physical targeting and merely sought to indicate directions of planning. The main contours of almost all figure strategy till 1991, as well as giving the basic structure and also the thrust of economic strategy emerged with the second 5-year plan. The second 5-year plan, launched in 1956 to 57, was part of a general strategy of development and was accompanied by other policy measures. The framework of second 5-year plan, with minor modifications, remained the mainstay for all future plans and policies till the beginning of the 1990s. What were the main characteristics and features of second 5-year plan? Although you would have heard about this in detail in previous unit, at the cost of some repetition, let us set out its salient features. As mentioned in the previous unit, the architect of second 5-year plan was P.C. Mahalanobis. The central idea behind the second 5-year plan was that to rise the standard of living of the people, the economy needed to grow very fast, and for the economy to grow very fast, the planners felt that industrialization was the key. Industrialization meant that plants and machinery had to be set up which produce output. The second 5-year plan stressed the production of those machines that produce other machines as output. These industries where machines produce other machines and equipments are called heavy industry. Thus, the basic idea was that the productive capacity of the economy itself had to be increased. Consumer goods, being goods that are used for consumption, do not increase productive capacity. So, the argument was that while those machines that produce cars or shirts or watches are important, even more important are the machines that would produce cars or shirts or watches. Heavy industry was thus one of the central features of the second plan. The other key idea in the second plan was the desire to conserve foreign exchange, as well as to put into operation the idea that imports of machinery and equipments from abroad had to be curtailed. This strategy, where imports are substituted by domestically produced version of the same things, is called import substitution strategy. No doubt, this was promoted by the experience of India as a colonized nation and subsequent mistrust of foreign trade. Not only was foreign trade not seen as an engine of growth, it was actually thought that developing nations and their domestic industries would be adversely affected by foreign trade. Since the planets relied on like heavy industry and infrastructure like power and electricity, for which hydroelectric and thermal power plants and dams were set up. Nehru used to call dams the temples of modern India. It was recognized that huge investments would be required. The policymakers felt that the private sector would neither be willing nor able to make these huge investments. Hence, these heavy industries, infrastructure like power, and areas of strategic interests like defense production, the commanding heights of the economy were kept with the public sector. We see that heavy industry, import substitution, and placing of key industries with the public sector were the key features of second 5-year plan. But it is not true that the second 5-year plan completely neglected other sectors of the economy. In the 1950s itself, important institutions for rural development like the Community Development Program and Panchayati Raj were started. A handloom sector in Khadi and village industries commission were set up and encouraged. Also, the Planning Commission undertook a study to look at the minimum requirements to raise the standards of living of the poor sections over the subsequent 15 years. The second plan is often criticized on the ground that it pursued a strategy that focused on growth while neglecting distribution and not adequately attacking poverty. Was there no alternative to the Mahalanobis model of growth as spelled out above? Two economists, C.N. Vakil and P.R. Brahmananda, did not think so. They had propounded a plan model about the same time as Mahalanobis. In their model, they stressed production of agricultural products and these goods consumed by the poorer sections of the society. These goods bought by wages are called wage goods. 19.3. Some policies instruments for regulation and control. In the previous section, we appraised you of the broad strategy of planning. Planning of the nation's resources was the basic strategy adopted to steer the economy on a desired path towards development. In this section, we discuss some specific instruments used by government to realize its objectives. In addition to the presence of large public sector in industry, the government had an elaborate system of regulation and control for the private sector through promulgation of various acts. Industries in private sector were regulated by the provisions of the Industries Act 1951. Secondly, to prevent the growth of private monopolies and concentration of economic power, the government enacted the Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices Act in 1969. Thirdly, in order to regulate the import of inputs and final goods, the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act (FERA) was enacted in 1973. Government regulations were not only for industry but also for agriculture, finance, and foreign trade sectors. Let us now consider some of these regulations. The government kept with itself key infrastructure, core and heavy industries. For private industry, an entrepreneur had to obtain a license to invest or expand capacity or change output mix or relocate his industry. In the external sector, there was the exchange control system under which exporters had to surrender export earnings to the Reserve Bank of India at the official exchange rate and take earnings in domestic currency. There was import licensing under which a firm had to obtain permission to import raw materials or capital inputs or consumer goods. For the capital markets for financial assets like equity shares and debentures. If a company wanted to float shares or borrow funds by offering debit instruments, there was capital issues control under which access to debit and equity markets were regulated. Other than this, there was price control on several consumption goods and key inputs such as coal, iron, petroleum, etc. There were several types of control that were put in place. Industrial licensing system, exchange control system, import licensing, capital issues control, price controls, and other ad hoc measures and controls for priority sectors. After nationalization, banks were subjected to directed and selective credit controls, controls on deposit and lending rates, and various types of reserve requirements. These controls were discretionary rather than rule based and regular. Allocation was mainly in the form of quantity restrictions rather than price or market based. Moreover, these controls were anticipatory rather than being used for punishing for non compliance. Many of these controls worked at cross purposes and tended to compound delays and inefficiencies. Most of these controls, moreover, did not fulfill the objectives for which they were implemented. 19.4 Performance of the Indian economy over 1951 to 91, an appraisal. We can assess the performance of the Indian economy in two ways. First, we can look at the objectives of planning as well as the targets that were set for various indicators such as growth of national income, investment, etc. in various plans, and see how far these objectives were realized and the targets achieved in each plan. Alternatively, we can see what broad strategies were adopted and what policies were followed and what had been the outcome of these policies. We can see if these policies have been unsound per se or if they were sound, whether they were implemented properly. It may even be possible that while these policies were appropriate and correct initially, over time they outlived their use and continued long after they should have been abandoned and discarded. In fact, to look at the performance by the first method necessarily involves adopting the second one. Because when we try to see whether targets were reached and whether objectives were realized, we have to see the behavior over time of the variables that were influenced by the strategies followed. As mentioned in the previous unit, the basic objectives of all the plans in India have been largely been threefold. First, to make the economy grow, that is, to aim for a sustained increase in national income. Secondly, to ensure that social justice is provided to people. Social justice broadly encompasses ideas of equity, poverty alleviation, meeting minimum and basic needs, and generation of employment. Thirdly, the achievement of self-reliance. The concept of self-reliance has undergone a change in meaning over time, although broad objectives of planning have stayed the same. What was changed, particularly after 1991, have been the strategies and the policy framework. The planning processes assumed that investment in basic and capital goods industry was desirable. The plans also assumed that capital goods could not or would not be imported. Because of this, priority was not given to exports of industrial products. Moreover, since the planning strategy focused on development of capital goods and heavy industry, a dynamic growth of consumer goods industry did not take place. As a result, the capacity utilization in the capital goods sector was suboptimal. This pushed up the price of capital goods and made them higher than those prevailing in international market. Another weakness of the planning process as well as the democratic system has been the structural weakness of the Indian state. Large number of interest groups and pressure groups sprang up in this period, which competed for the benefits of development and lead to suboptimal resource allocation. Very often, the benefit did not go to the intended beneficiaries. Finally, the Indian planning process did not provide adequate incentive for capital formation in the private sector and for entrepreneurship. Two main targets of the planning process were first, to generate the investment necessary for the targeted growth. For this, it was necessary to make investors believe in the possibility of growth so that they were induced to invest. Secondly, the planning process was to be able to generate enough savings for this purposes. For this purpose, before planning process started in India, the rate of saving was quite low. What has been the performance of the Indian economy over the period of 1951 to 1901? In this period, the national income increased at the rate of around 4% per annum. Since population increased at the rate of about 2% per annum, per capita income increased at the rate of 2% per annum. This was not enough to raise a large section of the poor above the poverty line. Moreover, the pattern of growth was not such as to absorb labor and create employment, GDP and population growth. The first 5-year plan had almost objectives. For one, it wanted to raise national income about Rs 9100 crores to 10,000 crore, implying an annual growth rate of 2.13%. Another target was to raise the investment rate from 5% of the national income to 7%. These targets were achieved. The first 5-year plan was actually a collection of modest projects aimed at basic reconstruction of the economy. For most of the 1950s, the economy performed favorably. The second and subsequent 5-year plans targeted at an annual rate of GDP around 5%. The targets for growth of GDP were 5% for the second and third 5-year plans. 5.5% of the fourth and fifth year plan was fourth and fifth 5-year plan. The targets for growth of GDP were 5% for the second and third 5-year plans, 5.5% for the fourth and fifth 5-year plans, while the target was lowered to 5.2 in the sixth 5-year plan. Over the period 1980-81 to 1989-90, the actual growth of GDP was 5.18% per annum as compared to 3.52% per annum over 1952-51 to 1982-81. Over this period, population grew at a rate of 2.15% per annum. Even in this period, 1982-81 to 1989-90, population grew at 2.13% per annum. Taking the entire period of 1950-51 to 1989-90, per capita GDP grew at 1.55% per annum. The first 5-year plan had projected that the per capita GDP would double in about 27 years. However, in reality, GDP doubled in 40 years. This high rate of population growth implied that the labor force would grow fast, and indeed it grew at the rate of 2.4% per annum over the period 1960 to 90. Growth in employment, however, lagged behind, growing at 2% per annum in the 1960s and 1970s and at 1.8% per annum in the 1980s. The growth in employment in agriculture was quite low in the 1980s, less than 1% per year. Agricultural production as a whole has grown at a fairly constant rate of 2.6% per annum over the period 1951 to 1990. In the 1950s, much of the increased production came through the expansion of cultivated area. Later on, the scope for bringing in additional area under cultivation decreased. Then, in the mid 1960s, the new agricultural strategy, popularly known as the Green Revolution, was launched. This entailed the use of 4 complementary inputs. Number 1, high yielding variety HYV seeds. Second, chemical fertilizers. Third, machineries such as tractors and harvester threshers. And fourth, irrigated water facilities. Thus, in the period since the mid 1960s, much of the increase in output has come through increased in yield, but at the same time it is true that fluctuations and instability in the production of food grains has increased in the period since the green revolution was put into operation. What had been the main features and patterns of agriculture in India in the period from independence till Krika 1990? Remember that agricultural growth was actually negative in the 15 years preceding independence. Moreover, agricultural production was slightly lower in 1947 than in 1901 for undivided India. So, definitely in the period since independence, agricultural growth and productivity has shown marked progress, although it is well behind the yield level achieved in developed countries. India achieved self-sufficiency in food grains during mid-1970s. That is, India no longer resorts to massive imports of food grains. But some problems remain. The geographical base of high-performing regions has to be expanded. It has mainly been confined to Punjab, Haryana, western part of Uttar Pradesh and some other regions. Secondly, public investment in agriculture has declined since 1980s. This has led to sluggish growth rate in agriculture in 1990s. Sustained use of high yielding seeds and intensive cultivation has led to deteriorating soil fertility. Groundwater has been overexploited so that there is a depletion in water table. Industry. The share of manufacturing in the country's GDP increased sixfold between the quinquennium 1951 to 55 and 1985 to 90. Growth in manufacturing was faster in first three plans than during the late 1960s and 70s. The late 1980s saw a revival of industrial growth. Over the period 1951 to 90, medium and large industry grew faster than small and cottage industries. Also, within the small sector, household type industries using traditional techniques declined sharply. This sector has also seen a sharp rise in employment. A notable feature of industry in India has been the diversification of industrial base. This has occurred particularly in the factory sector but also in the small industry sector. In 1950, about 65% of industrial output consisted of consumer goods. About 25% was intermediate goods and the rest capital goods by the late 1980s. The three categories had roughly equal shares in factory sector output. Another characteristic of Indian industry has been the rise in indigenous enterprise and the emergence of several new centers of manufacturing. The sixth five-year plan 1980 to 1985 recognized that the policy of reservation for small scale sector had tended to be negative in character and that it had been overprotected. Therefore, the sixth and seventh five-year plan suggested that development of the small and large industries should proceed in an integrated manner. The growth of industrial output in India had consistently fallen short of targets mentioned in the five-year plans, except for the first five-year plan. This is evident from table 19.1 given below. Inflation. A source of stability of the economy is that of stability in general price level. This roughly means inflation should be low and stable. When inflation is high, it has adverse effects on savings and investment and hurts the poorer sections of the population. Over the plan period, there has been a steady rise in the general price level. In the period 1950 to 70, inflation varies between 5 and 6% per annum, while in the 1970s and 1980s it was roughly around 10% per annum. Foreign trade. India's foreign trade performance can be analyzed in terms of three aspects: volume of trade, composition of trade, and direction of trade. Direction of trade denotes the nations with which India traded. In the period 1950 to 1966, India's export hardly increased. In 1966, the Indian rupee was devalued to bring domestic prices alignment with international prices. However, exports did not grow immediately. Exports picked up only after 1972 to 73. Since 1986 to 87, a sharp rise in exports has taken place. In 1950 to 51, exports as a percentage of India's national income was 6.8. In 1960 to 61, it was 4.2. In 1970 to 71, it fell to 3.8. It increased to 5.4% in 1980-81 and 6.9 in 1990-91. India's exports as a percentage of world export was 2.2% in 1950-51, 1% in 1960-61, 0.64% in 1970-71, 0.42% in 1980-81, and 0.52% in 1990-91. This shows that although India's exports grew over this period, world exports grew much faster. This means that India could not seize the opportunity for export-led growth, especially over 1960 to 1990. Over the period 1951 to 1990, the consumption of India's exports has undergone a remarkable change. In the beginning of the period, exports consisted largely of primary products like tea. Over the period, processed gems and jewelry, engineering goods, and textiles sharply increased their share in the export basket. As far as imports are concerned, the government had adopted the import control policy. This included measures like import licensing, quotas, banning of some imports, as well as tariffs. The initial objective behind these policies was to conserve foreign exchange and protect domestic industries. Employment generation. Employment generation can take place through expansion of industries, large, small, and cottage industries. Also, the agriculture and service sectors create jobs for people. However, in India, employment generation has been slower than the growth in labor force. Large investment in the public sector helped in creation of employment in the organized public sector. The slow growth in employment has been because of many factors such as slow growth in agricultural production, slow expansion of manufacturing sector, and concentration of investment in the capital goods industry. This has resulted in unemployment in the economy. Distributive justice. India has had an unenviable record in distributive justice. In the agricultural sector, some positive achievements have been recorded in terms of abolition of jamindars and security of tenure. For the country as a whole, however, the progress in land reforms has been poor, although a few states have performed remarkably well. Since the mid 1960s, when the Green Revolution was launched, insecurity of tenure has gone up in many areas. Although there has been some limited increase in capitalist farming, it has not led to perceptive rise in employment. Moreover, the benefits of Green Revolution due to irrigation, HIV seeds, and machinization has largely been to richer farmers. The inequality in distribution of income and wealth does not seem to have gone down in rural areas. In the industrial sector, there has taken place over time an increase in monopoly and a rise in concentration of economic power. The industrial licensing policy pursued till 1991 promoted neither efficiency nor equality in industrial sector. India has lacked a consistent, well-formulated strategy for balanced regional development. This has been true both in the absence of an effective policy regarding location of industrial projects as well as in the highly selective nature of agricultural growth In terms of regions, what can be said is that over the period 1950 to 91, regional disparity did not go down. Added to this is the fact that some states have very high per capita state domestic product compared to other states. Moreover, many of the richer states in 1951 continued to be so in 1990, while some states that were among the poorest in 1951 were also poor in 1990. India has lacked a consistent, well formulated strategy for balanced regional development. This has been true both in the absence of an effective policy regarding location of industrial projects as well as in the highly selective nature of agricultural growth in terms of regions. What can be said is that over the period 1950 to 91, regional disparity did not go down. Added to this in the fact that some states have very high per capita state domestic product compared to other states. Moreover, many of the richer states in 1951 continued to be so in 1990, while some states that were among the poorest in 1951 were also poor in 1990. Alleviation of poverty and rising the standard of living have been integral components of social justice in India. These have also been among the central objectives of economic planning. In the first 4 decades, two phases of poverty alleviation can be discerned. In the first phase, which continued till the fourth plan, the primary emphasis was on economic growth because it was felt that growth will itself take care of equity and that the benefits of growth will trickle down to the poorer sections. Beginning with the fifth plan, poverty was sought to be removed through a direct attack on poverty. To this end, several explicit anti poverty programs were launched and were directed towards selected target groups. If we take the rise in real income per capita as a rough overall measure of well-being, some improvements has taken place over the last 4 decades, with per capita income at constant prices almost doubling between 1950 to 51 and 1990 to 91. Per capita availability of food grains increased by about 13% over this period. Enrollment in primary school level in the age group 5 to 14 has risen from 25% to 50%, and overall literacy rate has gone up from 18% to 52%. Life expectancy at birth has increased from 32 years to 60 years. Overall death rates as well as infant mortality rate have declined. Performance of the Indian economy in the era of economic reforms. Normally, the word reform means to form again. It also means to make better by making necessary changes. For instance, we say that a very good teacher can reform the delinquent and truant students in a school. Applied to the society or economy, it means much the same thing. Thus, we know that certain religious and social reforms took place in Indian society in the 19th century. When we talk of necessary economic reforms in a similar vein, we mean that certain changes are necessary to improve the performance of the economy and give it a new flip. Very often, the difference between these necessary changes and the earlier situation is of kind rather than of a degree. A mere tinkering with existing instruments and policies will not do. What is required is to give the economy a new path, steer a new course, and provide a new framework. Now, reforms can be of many types, and there is no reason to think that the kind seen in India and elsewhere is the only one possible. But for historical reasons, it so happened that since the 1950s, when several developing nations embarked on their journey of development, a great faith was placed on the state in most of these nations for steering the economy. Some nations like China and Cuba were outright socialist, with the machinery and productive resources almost entirely owned and controlled by the state. Others, like India, were mixed economies. with a large private sector but with pervasive and presence in the economy and a host of controls and regulations. In all of these nations, it began to be felt by the late 90s that the performance was not matching the promise. So, in almost all countries, the state began to lessen its control over the economy and open more areas of economic activity to the private sector. In some cases, the process of privatization was imitated with selling part or sometimes all of ownership of state owned companies. Another important features of these reforms has been increased integration of the nation with the international economy. One of the earliest to carry out such reform was China, which started reforms in 1978. There could be other types of reforms. Policymakers in some country might feel that the presence of private sector is too high. Hence, some industries ought to be taken over by the state. Also, that the state ought to increase its presence in the economy. Indeed, such events have taken place in many countries in 1940s, 50s and 60s. These policy steps could also be called reforms, but this term was not in vogue then. Thus, reforms came to acquire a specific connotation and synonymously have came to be called liberalization. What does this term mean? In block 3, you have came across the idea of liberalism. So you know that the classical notion of liberal, it means greater faith in individualism, in individual enterprise and individual liberty. The role of the state is lessened. The suffix "ization" suggests that it is a process, an intensification of a trend. Thus, liberalization, simply put, is increasing the process of making the economy more liberal. This entails a twofold process. First, the private sector and private enterprise is given greater play in the economy, and the role of the state is reduced. The role of the market is enlarged. Secondly, the economy is integrated more with the global or international economy with increased foreign trade and investment. You must have come across the term globalization. This means greater integration of the world through increased flow of goods and services across national borders, greater investment, capital and financial flows among the countries, and faster and quicker information and communication channels. We often hear the term global economy to global village or the statement the world is becoming smaller. No doubt globalization is related to liberalization. Some even consider globalization and liberalization both to be a part of reform. In the next unit you will learn about globalization in greater detail. There is a slight difference in the operation of the two processes. Although liberalization implies a lesser role for the state, it still is a policy put into operation by the state. The state takes a policy to lessen its own role, particularly of regulation and ownership. Globalization, on the other hand, is a partly autonomous process. For example, forces in communication and information technology such as internet can arise spontaneously and without design by governments, which intensify globalization. As we mentioned earlier, there was some disenchantment with the industrial licensing system as well as with the controls in industry and some other areas such as financial markets and institutions. There were some piecemeal attempts at domestic reforms since the 1970s and 1973. Large industrial houses and foreign companies were allowed to set up capacity in some basic and core industries. The report of Narsimham Committee 1985 suggested that physical controls should be replaced by direct controls in the form of fiscal incentives and disincentives. Some measures were taken to lower barriers to entry in industrial markets. limit the role of licensing and giving some flexibility in using existing capacities. However, very little attention was given to the policy of allowing closure of industry, the so-called exit policy and policy towards sick industries. What was the nature of the immediate crisis that prompted the policymakers to go in for reforms? In June 1991, foreign exchange balance was down to $1 billion, which was just enough to pay for 6 weeks imports. The economy was in a severe balance of payments crisis. At the same time, there was a severe fiscal crisis. Although the economy had grown by over 5% per annum in the second half of the 1980s, this rate of growth was higher than in previous time periods. This growth was achieved at the cost of considerable fiscal extravagance and wastefulness. In order to tackle the crisis, India had to approach the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank for loans. In return, the IMF and the World Bank suggested certain structural adjustments, such as reduction in fiscal deficit, devaluation of currency, and opening up of the economy. Under the Structural Adjustment Program, the World Bank suggested reforms which called for changes in the basic structure of the economy. It necessitated replacement of quantitative restrictions and resource allocation process with market-based price signals and incentives. The overall objective conditionalities was of IMF to bring in macroeconomic stabilization, which required reduction in fiscal deficit. Broadly, the difference between government expenditure and revenues. The balance of payments deficit, the difference between payment made to foreign countries and earning from the foreign countries. We now discuss some measures towards domestic liberalization adopted in India since 1991. In July and August 1991, the government announced a new trade policy. Here, trade means foreign trade. On 24th July 1991, the government made a statement on industrial policy. The 1991 reforms did away with industrial licensing except for a few industries for location-related reasons or for environmental considerations. The reforms also removed the requirement of import licenses, except for some consumer goods. Restrictions were eased for foreign direct investment and portfolio investment. Sectors where private investments were earlier prohibited, such as power, saw private investments being allowed. Steps were taken for disinvestment of equity in public sector enterprises. What is still required are reforms of labor laws and the Industrial Disputes Act. The problem of industrial sickness has to be tackled. Other areas of reforms included easing restrictions in financial markets and going from a fixed to flexible exchange rate regime. The regulatory framework has also undergone substantial changes, particularly in telecom sector and financial markets. Economic reforms have also entailed severe changes for the reform of public enterprise and even privatization of public enterprises. Some other policy measures have included exploring private participation in infrastructure like power and roads, as well as giving thought on adoption of user charges in social sectors like health. Summary. In this unit, we learned the background behind formulation of India's development strategy after independence. We also attempted an assessment of the performance of the economy for the period from 1950 to 51. When planning was put in place till the present, we observed that although the economy had done well in several areas, some severe problems remained. India has succeeded in attaining self-sufficiency in food grains and no longer has to import these. The industrial base has been large and well diversified. Moreover, there is a large pool of trained and scientific human resource base. The proportion of people living in absolute poverty has come down a bit as compared to the situation at the time of independence. There are some problem areas as well. Industrial growth has not been satisfactory and is almost consistently lower than targeted. Secondly, the rate of growth of employment in industrial sector has been less than the growth in production. In the 1980s, there were severe problems of public debt and mounting fiscal deficits, both at the center and the states. This set the scene for some half-hearted reforms in 1980s, which, due to the per- precipitation of severe crisis, forced the policymakers to go in for bold, direct changes in the economy. During the 1990s, there has been a series of measures towards economic liberalization.